Hey there, welcome back to another episode of Success Talks. I'm your host, Jared. I go by Self Taught Success on the internet. And the meaning of that name is all the information you're looking for is out there. It's just up to you to seek it out, find it, and then apply it on the path to your goals. And staying on brand with that, we like to bring on lots of successful entrepreneurs to hear their success story. And today we have on multi-time successful founder, Emil Barr. Emil, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, excited to get into the conversation. I've seen you all around social media lately. I know you just had a big piece in the Wall Street Journal, and then you're on Fox and a bunch of stuff like that talking about it. So before we get into that, I'd just kind of like to hear your entrepreneur origin story. How did you get started? What was that initial fire to get you going to start your first business?
Well, so this is what I'll explain it as. When I was a kid, I really wanted to be a concert pianist up until the age of like 8 or 9 years old. And so I would practice with this very strict piano teacher and I'd play piano 5 or 6 hours a day until like my fingertips literally bled. But the problem was I wasn't particularly good and I never actually won any piano competitions. And so then when I turned 12, 13, I sort of set my sights in becoming a tennis player. And I spent a lot of time, I would wake up 2 or 3 hours before school, go play tennis, and then I would practice for 3 or 4 hours after school. And I did all right. But I remember there was this one time where I was playing this tennis tournament and I lost the second or third round match to a kid that was a football athlete that literally picked up a tennis racket like 3 months ago. So when I started my first company, I think it was for many of the reasons lots of people do it. I started it when I was 18. I was a freshman in college. Honestly, like I wanted to buy a cool car and I wanted to have a little bit of money to go out. But we grew to millions of dollars in revenue in our first few months. Like we were signing up clients like Kroger, Nike, P&G. That business grew to about 100 people in our first 2 years of business. And it didn't feel nearly as difficult or painful as playing piano or playing tennis. So that was the first time I ever really felt good at something and I felt like the football player. I realized there was a degree of natural talent or affinity for this. And so then I just sort of devoted the rest of every waking minute to trying to become as good at being a founder or being a leader or a CEO as I could.
Part of the reason I love business, and once I was done with sports, I really grew to love business is that competitive side. It really is a sport in its own nature, as far as a lot of those same things that people love about sports, the competitiveness, the team, the competition, and just that will to reach new heights. It's very much present in the business world as well. And it's a very open playing field. In sports, there's a very strict set of rules. Versus once you move over to the business side, is you can kind of create your own rules in certain aspects. So I definitely think that's cool. You mentioned that first business doing millions of dollars. You started out in your dorm room, and I know you raised I think like $900,000 from investors. So how did you do that, and what were those terms? And also, if you're raising that money without any kind of backing, what was the plan to pay back those investors if everything went to crap?
Yeah, I mean, what were they gonna do at the end of the day? Like, I had no assets. Like, are they gonna take, like, my dorm room, like, T-shirt? Like, they didn't have many assets, so I think that made it easier to take those risks. I think that fundamentally, the goal of that business is we were solving a very real problem. We were starting to do TikTok marketing before TikTok became mainstream, so I remember our first meeting with our first Fortune 500 company. I took and I drove 2 hours to their headquarters. It was just me, and I went up to the 47th floor and I was in, college kid wear, so jeans and a t-shirt. And I went in and they had all these like 12 guys dressed in business casual. And they said, all right, let's see your deck. And I asked, what's a deck? And that's about how well that meeting went.
Oof.
But we were still able to close that client, and I think
Man,
that's when we
how do you go from I don't have a deck or like I don't know what a deck is, and then by the end of the call, he's like, okay, this guy's actually competent. How do
well,
you get
TikTok was the future. They might not be on it, but their kids were on it. And it was definitely where their kids were finding new brands. And they could go hire some old guy in a suit that looked like them, I think was the actual language I used. Or they could hire someone like me that really understood the market and our team that, was living in it every day and just had an intuitive understanding and grow aggressively on the platform. And so I guess that messaging resonated. I also think we really underpriced ourselves. So that probably helped. Within that 6 month period, we had to like triple our pricing, but it was great because it gave us the credibility and that logo to be able to go to other brands. And there's almost a sense of like, okay, well, if, this Fortune 500 company trusts them to do their TikTok, then as medium sized business, we should trust them as well. And we were able to capture market share pretty quickly from there on out. So Really glad I did it. And maybe, I'm even glad I didn't bring a deck because maybe that made it really reinforced sort of like the youthful edge.
Yeah, there you go. So you mentioned that as far as not having the deck, I'm a big believer in like there's specialized knowledge is very critical, but also as an entrepreneur, for myself, somebody who became a self-taught entrepreneur, not going to college and just like figure it out. There's some things that I feel like I know this topic better than anybody else, or I'm like in the top 2% of knowledge on this topic, but on this super basic topic that I never took time to research on myself, I know very, very little. And so that's kind of what it sounds like with you. You were an expert in the TikTok marketing. You knew that better than anybody else, but you didn't necessarily know what a deck is. So it's kind of like that same example. So what would you say as far as specialized knowledge and how important that is for entrepreneurs and really understanding what you do?
I think the only thing that matters when you're getting your first $1 million a year in revenue is, are you actually solving a problem for people? I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs that wonder if they have PMF, or they're like, hey, we're going to burn $4 million of investor capital to find product market fit. And I
Yeah.
just think that's so crazy because when you have product market fit, you know it. You can sell your product without a deck. You have your existing customers are referring you to 4, 5, 10 customers a piece without even having to ask them. And oftentimes you have to have a wait list where you can't actually take on all of the potential business at once because so many people want whatever problem you're solving. And whether it was in our first business that grew to $1 million in revenue the first 8 months, or this most recent one, which actually grew to $4 million in revenue in our first 8 months, when you have product market fit, it's something that feels very, very real. And so I think it's less about a question on whether you have enough domain expertise to be the perfect solution to this problem, or you're just an outsider that's identified a really real problem. I think it's that the market will speak to itself. And if you're able to get to that $1 million of revenue in your first 6 or 12 months, you're probably onto something really big that's scalable. If you're not, it might be time to reevaluate and see, does it make sense, or are there tweaks we can make to this business model to pick up more customers way faster?
I think something you hit on there that really resonates that I see all over X and I just feel like is so important. Just go get a customer. Go get one customer and talk to them and figure out what's good, what's bad, and go from there. A lot of this other research and spend, especially in startups, I see it where they raise a bunch of money, so they have a bunch of money, so they spend it like they have a bunch of money, and maybe they don't quite spend it in the wisest ways. But the reality is, business is made by revenue, and if you go get a client, you're on your way to reaching that goal. So I definitely think that's important. So you talk about raising that money, kind of having your backs against the wall, but really nothing to lose. Once you kind of got your footing with that, how did you go from scaling that up, making your first $1 million in your dorm room to the exit? What did that process look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we focused on building as big of a business as possible, and then people came knocking. We were at about 100 people. This was my junior
Uh,
year of college, so I was 21 years old. I could legally drink finally, and I think partially the firm that came to us was willing to pay a very high premium over kind of what our bankers and lawyers were saying the market rate of the company was. I think part of it was I wasn't sure I wanted to be the TikTok marketing guy forever because I had just had lunch with a billionaire who I'd really admired from like a young age that I'd read about. And I was talking to him and he was basically saying, why are you messing around with this TikTok stuff? He's like, if you want to become a billionaire, what you have to do is you have to solve a really big problem. Your personal capital outcome is directly proportional to the size of the problem you solve. So if you solve
yeah,
a very small niche problem, you'll have a small niche capital outcome. And he's like, you should be thinking about things like unemployment, space travel, sea exploration, not how do we provide slightly better marketing stacks to Fortune 500 brands. And so that really motivated me and was the point where I said, okay, let's talk to some of these guys. Let's take these offers in. And ultimately, we went with the firm that offered us a good deal and felt would be a good culture fit for the people that were leaving. I think I was somewhat of an oddity, being 21 in these rooms and still not knowing most of it. And I think the bankers got sort of a chuckle out of that. But ultimately, we had built a really good business that was solving things for people. And also, I kind of wanted a Ferrari. So we got the deal done pretty quickly. I got my Ferrari and then kind of like really started to think and focus on what are the big problems I can solve that will actually make a seminal impact on society at large, as opposed to just put money in my pocket.
I think that's great. And I think a lot of times, it's kind of hard to start on those $1 billion ideas, I guess you would say, when you don't have any capital to work with. So you can raise money or whatever, but I think a lot of times being in a position like you where you've had one successful exit or you've had this success where your business produced a lot of capital that you can then reinvest into the next venture helps a lot. So what would you say for early founders, early entrepreneurs who are trying to make that first million, trying to go 0 to 1? Which, by the way, I just ordered Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1. That got here yesterday, so I'm excited to dive into that. But how do you?
Agreed.
What's your $1 million playbook? You did your first $1 million in your dorm room. What does that look like?
Yeah. So first of all, I challenge the assumption that you need a lot of capital to grow to a couple $1 million in revenue. Both of my businesses bootstrapped their way to millions of dollars in revenue before we took on any
Well,
outside
I'm
investment.
not saying for the first million. The first million, I think you're basically kind of building from nothing. But as far as the world changing thing, as far as to get to 1 billion, you probably need some capital from
Well,
that first business.
I'd counter that by saying I never had to put more than I think $5,000 in a Flashpass, and we've grown to $5 million in ARR in our first 9 months. That being said, we are going to go out and raise capital because I think when it comes to expanding to as many cities and states and countries as possible, capital does make a difference. But really, to answer your question, I think the playbook is it's basically a three-step playbook if you want to become whatever you want to call it, anecdotally rich in your dorm room, or you want to become a millionaire while you're still in college, right?
Yeah.
So the first is you have to start a business and solve a problem for people. I think something like 80% of business millionaires in America are business owners. When you look at young millionaires, that number is probably north of 99%, if I had to guess. The second piece is try to focus on growth and capturing market share more than just profitability. I don't think I ever took a dollar out of Step Up Social or Candid, almost until a few months before we started to sell the business because we were so focused on becoming as large as possible and not really focused on like, oh, how do we get a $200,000 salary or $300,000 salary out of this business? And I think with that frame of mind, you start thinking about expansion more than you start thinking about margins. And then the third piece is you've got to sell that business. But it's a lot easier to sell a business with a ton of market share and you've left room to improve the margins because that type of stuff is super attractive to a private equity fund, to like a retail buyer. There's all these guys coming out of Harvard Business School now that like want to buy a small business. Like that's their whole thing through platforms like Micro Acquire. And if you can prove that you've built a large customer base and captured a significant amount of market share and you're an actual player in the space, it will be 50 times easier to sell that business than if you have a niche business with three people, but that's super profitable. Then you sort of created a job for yourself, not a couple $1 million in enterprise value. But if you follow that playbook, I think it's very possible to become a millionaire in a matter of 2 to 3 years, no matter where you're starting from, whether you're 18 in a dorm room like me, or whether you're 35 and a teacher looking to do something else. I think the problem is oftentimes people don't want to follow that playbook to a T. The steps and the knowledge and the resources to become a millionaire are out there, but instead they choose to prioritize things like work-life balance. They choose to move to a different city where they have no customers because they want to follow their girlfriend. They want to go work at the sexy job, like that the Google or the White House that's going to have a lot of brand name credibility instead of doing something unsexy like staying up until midnight building a business. And that's where they mess up and they aren't able to unlock financial independence for themselves.
You mentioned basically just when you have a business and you stick a multiplier on it, it's a lot easier to see that $1 million path versus, I'm going to get this salary and then I'm going to invest it. I'm going to earn a little bit. And after how many years, it's going to add up to $1 million. I think it kind of depends on what you're chasing. If you're just looking for rapid growth and you want an exit and you want that higher net worth, really just growing the business as big as it can go is the fastest way to do it. I want to transition a little bit. You mentioned work-life balance. I know you just had a big piece in the Wall Street Journal that I've seen floating around quite a bit lately, and you're on Fox and Friends talking about it. So tell us more about that. Tell us about the article. Tell us what your view is on the work-life balance, what Gen Z is getting right, what they're getting wrong. I'd love to hear you dive into that a little bit more.
Well, first, I do want to echo back to something you said. I think you totally nailed it, Jared. I'll even take it one step further and say we're going through a new gold rush. This is a once in a generation thing. And I don't think in 30 years we're going to see the same level of enterprise value in the markets. But we live in
Yeah.
a really weird time where there's so much money flowing through private equity funds. And there's all these
Yeah.
platforms like acquire.com and all these different marketplaces where you can essentially create a digital business with no employees, grow it to 5 to 6 paying customers at a couple $100,000 in revenue and have a competitive bidding process that's trying to put a couple $1 million in your pocket. I think that's very unique because in the olden days, even 20 years ago, if you had a small business, you were a small business owner. You couldn't go sell that small business for $6 million to a private equity firm based out of Florida that's going to combine it with 10 other small businesses in the hopes of selling it to a larger private equity firm. I'm not sure that business model is sustainable, but while it exists, I think it makes sense to strike when the iron is hot and spin up as many of these small, and I use that relatively $2, $3 million exits as possible. Because if you can put $3 million in your pocket, you were set relatively for life. And I just wish more Americans understood it because I think it's this really like unique period in the economy and period in time that we're not going to see happen again and be available to us in 15 or 20 years.
So I'm gonna carry on that. We're gonna pause on the work life balance part because now I got my wheels turning.
That one
What do you
gets me.
think? What do you think is critical for those companies when they're going to exit? Do they have to have books in order? What is it? And I think a lot of those businesses too is CEO, the founder, is the face of the brand. So if they sell the company, they kind of are the company. So it kind of makes it hard to sell in that sense. Is that a deal where you sell it, but then you stay on as paid founder essentially? What does that look like? And when people are looking for that exit, what do they need to know?
I think that it's a good question. The less you can show that the business needs you to run, the better. But also, I think it's unrealistic for a company to go in and buy you and expect that the founder's not going to be involved. Here's the thing: most of these companies are going to fire the founder within the first 12 months. Just statistically, 70 to 80% of the time, they want the founder out of that business because they want to run it their way and they don't want to run it your way. Especially if you have a non traditional, non Harvard Business School background. What does a college kid know about running an agency? Well, enough for you guys to pay a couple $1 million for my business, but not enough to keep you around. And that happens time and time and again. And
Yeah.
so you can use it as a leverage point in conversations and say, hey, I'm committed to this transition. I want to stay on. At the same time, I don't want to take a big earnout because the data shows that 3 to 4 times the founder is fired by the acquiring company. So I don't want half of my offer to be tied to whether you fire me or not, because that's not fair to me. And you can use those things to negotiate essentially a higher cash offer. And then at the end of the day, just make peace with the fact that they fire you or make peace with the fact that you want to leave, after a year or after 6 months or whatever. And maybe that offer, if $1 million is contingent on staying 3 years, I would just look at that offer as a $3 million offer instead of a $4 million offer and make your decisions from there.
No, I think that's great. Or, you mentioned higher cash offer, or in your case, you can just negotiate in a Porsche 911 just for the fun of it. So there's a bunch of options in
Yeah, I mean, the key is if you have lots of competitive bids and people interested in your business, you can do all sorts of crazy stuff, like tell your investors you want a free car at closing.
there. Hey, if it works out, that's great. That's great. Um, and so to finish on that topic, one more, and then we can hop to the work life balance stuff. But as far as finding a partner for that exit, in my first business, I thought when I was ready to exit, I was like, okay, I'm going to sell to this guy. He's going to want it. No big deal. It'll be super easy. I talked to him. Nope, he doesn't want it. Then I was like, okay, well, then I had, guy A, B, C, D, E, and none of those guys wanted it. So I was trying to sell to a competitor, thought, of course, they'd want to take me in because, it just made sense to me, but it didn't to them, apparently. And so finally, after several months, I found somebody, I told him what I wanted. He said, sounds good, super easy. But it took some time to find that. For founders looking for that exit, where do you think the best way is to find that? Is it a customer? Is it a competitor? Is it through connections? Is it a website? What would you suggest?
I think that we live in a particular time period where it's so easy to find buyers because there's so many funds out there looking for investment opportunities. I've heard tons of success stories of people throwing stuff up on websites like acquire.com, making a few LinkedIn posts and getting 15 offers within a 2-week period. So
Hmm.
I'd say that I think that your experience is unique in the sense of that's where it was 5 to 10 years ago. But today, all these funds are so flush with cash. I think what's more important to think about is not get too caught up on your number. At the end of the day, all this stuff
Yeah.
is total fake. Enterprise value doesn't mean anything. You're essentially assigning an arbitrary value to some multiplier on your revenue. And if you don't have any profit, you're basically taking your monthly revenue, multiplying it by 18, and that's what someone is saying your business is worth. But that cash that they're going to transfer into your account is very real. So you're taking and assigning a totally arbitrary thing that means absolutely nothing and getting millions of dollars in real cash back into your account for it. So, if you find that a lot of offers are coming in at $2 million instead of $3 million, and you're sure that your business is worth $3 million, that might not be worth blowing up a deal over, especially if it's a business you built in 12 to 18 months and you feel confident that you can go build another one. Again, what I'm talking about here is this idea that it's impossible to become a millionaire in America today. The path is so unfair. The truth is, we live in the richest country in the world, and we have the highest ever historical income per capita in the country. And almost anyone can now become a millionaire with their laptop as long as they sort of follow the playbook we discussed earlier on this podcast.
Yeah, I know. I love that. That gets the juices flowing in me. I love that. Now let's jump into. I still got a lot of questions, but I want to get into this
All right.
work life balance part. You see me looking down. I'm taking notes as I'm talking to you right now. So good stuff. But talk to me about the work life balance. You had the Wall Street Journal piece. What does that look like? What is Gen Z getting right? What are they getting wrong? What's your perspective on that?
So I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal I actually didn't think was that controversial. Obviously, the internet proved me wrong, and the hundreds of media requests we got afterwards. But really, what the piece was centered around was, hey, there's this big narrative around 4-day work weeks and work life balance and fully remote work. And that is the absolute wrong way for young people to look at their careers. Because when you think about compounding, which Warren Buffett calls the, eighth wonder of the world or the ninth wonder of the world, if you can save up $1 million by the time that you're 30, that $1 million will turn into almost $40 million in an investment account by the time you retire. If you can get to $5 million by the time you're 25, you will retire a billionaire. And that's because you, instead of trying to make the majority of your retirement income and the majority of your life's income in the twilight stages of your career, when you should be there to take care of your kids and you're getting old and your health isn't what it used to be, you're taking the time when you have peak mental and physical stamina and advocating for a 4-day work week or trying to party more often than you're spending in office. So, what I advocate for is a totally different approach. Really dig in your 20s like I did. When I was building Candid, I regularly would work 120-hour weeks. I slept 3.5 hours a night. I gained 80 pounds and I lived basically right off of Red Bull, which was, I felt horrible. But at the end of the day, I graduated from college a multimillionaire. And as long as I don't touch that capital will be worth hundreds of millions of dollars by the time it's time for me to retire. That path is very possible. And in fact, I'd argue it's a lot easier to save up to $1 million by the time you turn 30 by really focusing and pushing your body to its limits and excelling in your chosen career or profession, as opposed to waiting until you're 40 or 50 to lock in and then being surprised and stressed and letting your family relationships and your spiritual relationships and all of your other relationships suffer as a result of the fact that you spent too much time in your 20s partying.
I share the same sentiment. I don't think it's controversial, but I also, I got to remind myself we live in a little bit of an echo chamber, on the side of X and the social media when everybody you talk to is young and they're making a lot of money. And then you run the numbers, in Grok, what percentage of people are this, this, and this. And it's like, oh, okay. So it's a pretty small percentage. And then you're reminded that of that echo chamber that a lot of people on the outside maybe aren't, quite that same spot. And you think about those things and what the opportunity cost of working a lot is, and whether good or bad. But you see those opportunity costs in real time. And my philosophy has been, um, I want to work hard now. And I want to get rich now. So when I'm married and I have kids, if I don't want to work, then I don't have to. And so I'm in the same boat of let's get after it. I think today's like day 1,520 consecutive days of consistency in that. And so I'm a big believer in that, and I have to be because after all that time, if I'm wrong, then that really sucks. So,
Congrats on
I'm
that.
definitely.
That's a really meaningful accomplishment. Congratulations.
Thanks, man. So I'm trying to make it happen. One of the things that I weigh a lot is, I've given up a lot of fun to be in the spot where I'm at, but I also understand I'm in a spot where I'm at, which is, a lot better than, maybe where I could have been because of those commitments that I made. There is an opportunity cost of fun. So
Yep.
how do you weigh a lot of that as far as enjoying life and having fun with also finding success where you can do whatever you want, take the vacations when you want, drive the car you want, have the house you want, not worry about, the electric bill and stuff like that. How do you weigh those opportunity costs?
I think that early, to your point, early success allows for flexibility. I also think that there's nothing wrong with either lines of thought. Let me get this right. I'm not anti work life balance necessarily. What I am is anti work life balance and then complaining about having to live with roommates or complaining about not being able to afford a particular type of lifestyle. And you see so much of this discourse online where it's now very in vogue to hate on entrepreneurs and people that have built things. And I just wish more people would realize that it's actually not out of reach. My feedback, Jared, is honestly, I think that your early 20s should be a very painful time. When you look at historically what the body has had to endure, in your early 20s, you were typically going out to war. You were literally getting shot at or, stabbed with a sword. And I don't think those people were getting their full 10 hours of sleep and only had to go to the battle 4 days a week. The human body is extremely resilient in your early 20s. You can, in fact, get on with 3 or 4 hours of sleep very effectively. You can eat one meal a day. And so instead of trying to work yourself to death in your 50s or 60s, to your point, when you have a family and maybe even grandkids that you want to take care of, it's okay to be a little bit of uncomfortable and to be a little bit of in pain in your early 20s because your body was designed to withstand that. And if the cost of that is instead of survival, the cost of that is true economic flexibility and freedom for the rest of your life, for me, that's a sacrifice that I want to make. It's okay if you don't want to make that sacrifice. It's okay to say, hey, I want to be a bit lazy in my 20s, or I want to travel around in my 20s. There's nothing wrong with that. But then you can't turn around and look at people that live a different lifestyle than you and say that it's somehow unfair or a symptom of our tax system or our political system why those people have so much more than me. It's because they chose to go through extreme pain and sacrifice to get there.
I think that's brilliant. Basically, you get to make those choices, but you have to be okay with the outcomes. I think there's a validity in that. So
We can't be the generation as a Gen Z that criticizes the cost of living crisis and then turns around and wants to work from home in our pajamas. It's totally fine to have either of those tracks, but the truth is that there's never been more opportunity out there with the digital economy, with the sources of funding available to build meaningful enterprise value and financial independence in your early 20s.
absolutely, which makes me think of spreading yourself too thin. And everybody always talks about multiple streams of income. Personally, I think it's a misconception in a lot of ways. I think it's great. I think there's a lot of power in it. But I also think for young people, I think it's a little bit of a distraction personally. And so my thesis is, and I'm bringing this up because you talk about the compound interest. If you can get X amount of dollars, invest it, compound, you get super rich. The numbers make sense on that. But what do you think about multiple streams of income versus this is what I'm good at? This is where all my focus is. I'm going to pour all my focus into here, make as much money as I can, and then move this money over here. And then, once you move that money over, are those active investments where you're actively, searching for, the next stock or the next deal or this or that? Or is that just something you put over here? It's a set deal. You kind of put it there, you forget about it, and then you go off to make as much money as you can in your business. What's your take on that?
Well, I think everyone's good at different types of business, and some people are really good at juggling, and some people are really bad at juggling. And it's a spectrum. I have a friend that owns 34 small businesses. Most of them are not related. Everything from hair salons to boba tea shops, and he crushes it. He has a lot more. He's making a lot more than I am. I also know that there are people who have a singularity of focus. They're extremely effective entrepreneurs that will advocate that you should never take your eye off the ball or your one core business. I'd say that for me, I've always been sort of a get really good and really focused and obsessive over the current problem I'm solving, the business I'm building. And then in terms of how I allocate my capital, I keep half in the S&P 500 and half in Bitcoin. I don't check it except for once a quarter. And sometimes with the Bitcoin, it's a rough afternoon. But at the end of the day, all of this stuff is just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's not going to materially change your life after you hit a certain income threshold. So what I'd rather do is spend all of my time focused on solving a really big problem like AI induced unemployment than spend my time worrying about the manager at my bar or if someone called off their shift at the boba tea restaurant. That's not the type of problems I enjoy solving or stressing about on a day-to-day basis.
That's a good answer. And I will say somebody who a lot of the clients I work with are, in that finance world. We do a lot with like the influencers in that world, a lot of publicly traded companies.
Yeah.
And to admit that you only check your portfolio once a quarter and actually stick with that is mega impressive. So kudos to you on that. So I want to transition a little bit. So we've
Yeah.
talked about your past and some of your views on business. What are you working on now? I know you have Flashpass, and that business it's grown a lot faster than the TikTok business did. What's been the process with that? And For the viewers who don't know, can you explain what that business is?
Yeah. So essentially, what we're doing is if you look at all the numbers and reports, AI is going to come in and change or replace anywhere between 25 to 50% of jobs. Well, most of our unemployment offices are already at max capacity. Our social services systems oftentimes are actually getting underfunded at this point, and a lot of community colleges and training centers across the state have wait lists. So all these people, anywhere between 100 and 150 million people, are going to need to find new work or some way to learn
Mhm.
about AI, and they currently have nowhere to go. Flashpass is the platform we're building to solve that. So we're a marketplace. People can go on our platform. They can earn credentials in anything from oil and gas production to cybersecurity and AI engineering. And then they can turn around and we'll actually match them with employers that are looking for people to work in their chip manufacturing facilities, in their offices. So we're a two-sided marketplace. It's totally free for the user to sign up and take any of the certifications. And our bet is that in the next 5 to 10 years, this problem is going to become very, very important. It's going to be top of mind for some, but it's also going to be top of mind for legislators and governments when they think about how do we solve AI coming in and taking a quarter of our constituency's jobs. And so we're essentially building the solution for that.
Well, I think that's good because it's going to be needed, and I think that's impacting a lot more jobs than people realize. You know, obviously, you hear those big companies, obviously Amazon and stuff like that, Microsoft, where they're getting rid of a bunch of jobs. But I think where you also see a difference is a lot of those companies, you know, that are smaller, maybe they have one or two employees instead of hiring a third. You know, now they're using AI as the third, and so it's not necessarily always firing those jobs, but it's not hiring those jobs, you know, and making that, I guess, that job market more scarce. But I'm always curious, you know, when people are starting these businesses, where does that idea come from to, you know, the napkin to actually putting it into action to making, you know, a company happen? How does that happen for with you guys in FlashPass?
I think you talked about this earlier today on the podcast, just finding your first customer. We had found our first 10 customers before we even had a website or landing page or a logo. And that's when we knew we were onto something. The more quickly you can find some customers that are willing to put down their credit cards or send a check to you to solve their problem, the much faster you can validate that you have a real problem and you're solving a real issue, and the much faster you can then scale and build functions around that business because you have revenue, which is the most important thing a business needs to survive and keep growing and expand. I'll tell you a dirty little secret, Jared. I probably had 14 to 15 other business ideas before FlashPass. Some of them
Mm.
were with really high profile people that I looked up to for a long time, and we tested it, and there was ultimately nothing there. Some of them were just ideas that I had thought that if I had the capital to start my own thing, I would start. And most of those, we just couldn't find lots of customers in the first 30 to 45 days that were willing to validate the problem. That's what made FlashPass different. And the fact that we had a couple $100,000 in committed revenue before we even had a website, that's when we knew we were onto something. And that was the business that I wanted to spend the next few years trying. So it really comes back down to that idea we talked about. Just find your first customer, find your first 5 customers. Don't worry about anything else with the business. Because if you can find customers with limited friction, and really get them signed up and on board and willing to pay to solve the problem, now you're on to something big.
Beautiful. And I always think it's good when people, you know, kind of reiterate points because it shows where you stand with that. You mentioned high profile people. I think a lot of times, you know, and I find myself in the spot of, you know, somebody, you know, super high profile, somebody very well off, very well connected, and you understand that this is a person that I might have one question or one favor to ask this person, and you know, if it goes wrong, that's the opportunity and it's gone. And if it goes right, I might get another one, and then I might be in, and then we, you know, get connected, do business together, whatever it may be. But how do you weigh that? Is this the opportunity that I'm going to ask them for that favor, or am I going to wait for the next thing? You know, how do you weigh that opportunity cost?
Don't. Never ask them for the favor unless you're 100% sure. The way that I was able to build a network of billionaires and celebrities, basically being a kid with, no money from the middle of Ohio and no one knew who my parents were, was I was useful to them, right? I was the TikTok guy. And through word of mouth and through the companies we work with, I could come in and they were curious, like, how do I grow on social media? How do I build a personal brand on TikTok? And all I did was provide value and give them that expertise and offer to do it for them at discounted rates. But I never once said, hey, can you do this for me? I think the few times that we've made asks, they've been very, very intentional. And my rule of thumb is typically no more than 1 or 2 asks per person, because ultimately they're not in this to be your friend. Everyone is asking them for things all the time. What you want to do is be as humanly useful to them as possible to stay within their network. And then
Mm.
when you really need something or they can really move the needle, you'll know what it is and what the right time to ask is. But oftentimes I've seen people get in front of someone like that, start to build a rapport, and they ruin it by making an ask within the first 3 months or 6 months. All you should be doing is providing as much value as humanly possible and making it clear that you're there to be useful to them, not the other way around.
I think that's brilliant. And one of the things that I've found, just in my journey is some of the most successful people that I've got to work with, a lot of the people who worked for them started working for free, where it was just like, just let me help you. And then that progressed. So I think there's a lot of value in being a value add for sure. So Emil, you mentioned, working with high profile people and celebrities. What is the difference? What separates those people that are well known? Is it a talent thing? Is it a connection thing? What makes those people so great and so successful in what they do?
I think that they have really good personal brands. They think very intentionally through how they present themselves to the world, regardless of whether they're a very accomplished business person or singer songwriter. When they think about their public facing image, everything is intentional. And then I think that all of them are deeply, deeply obsessed with their craft. The way that
Mm.
I became obsessed with business after starting my first company, they are obsessed with music or they're obsessed with their particular industry. I have met lots of successful people. I've met people from all sort of walks in life. The one common thread that every hyper successful billionaire or celebrity has in common is they are obsessed with what they do, and they're definitely not out here preaching work life balance.
And I love how you throw that part in. That's great. I always say the money is in the marketing, and when you look at artists or whatever it is, not necessarily like always the most talented, or you might not necessarily like their music, but their
Mhm.
marketing is incredible, and that's why they're so big. And I think the personal brand that you mentioned speaks very loudly. For me, when I started my business, all the people I was studying all had a large personal brand, and I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do, but if I build a personal brand like all those other people, I can probably figure out how to make money with it. So
Yeah.
that's kind of how I started. I'd love to hear you dive into a little bit more on the personal brand side. Obviously, you did the TikTok marketing. So can you just expand a little bit more about how the media today and the attention economy and how important building a personal brand is?
I'm not sure. That's something I'm trying to figure out myself. And that's because I think I had a strong personal brand with this sort of closed network of people I know, and it's been great in business. But when you think about getting to the next level, you have to find ways to expand that network. And I think that today, social media and just digital in general is a great way. It's a great magnifying glass for whatever your sort of face to face or in person personal brand or network is. So I wish I had a good answer for you. The short answer is I'm still trying to figure it out. I only started about 3 months ago, but hopefully I'll have some good insight for you next time we do this.
No, that works. I think it's good, that you're recognizing the fact that there is value in it. And what I always think is really cool about it too, and when we work with founders who have a lot of different businesses, is the personal brand stays with you after you sell the business. Like,
Mhm.
well, after you sell that business goes away, but your personal brand is still there. And then you already have an audience who understands you, knows your story. And so when you go to sell, the next product or the next service, you already have that audience for it. So I think there's definitely good value in it. And it's something that I always encourage a lot of founders or all founders. I think it's a helpful thing. So
Like, it's well, what you said there is like it's the greatest hack ever because you can use your business to pay for your personal brand. But after you sell that business, that cost still rests with the business. And you essentially have this really valuable asset that you've been able to use a company that no longer exists to invest and build up into to take into your next venture. So, yeah, it's like the biggest money saving hack ever. Spend your company's money on building a personal brand, sell that business, and use that personal brand to build an even bigger company next.
absolutely, and I always say it's a very much of an equal opportunity for everybody. Like, it doesn't matter what part of the country or what part of the world you're in, or whatever. Like, you have the same opportunity as everybody else as far as, turn the camera on and, click record or just start typing out post, and
Yeah.
so I think it's a beautiful thing. Emil, before we wrap up, I wanna kind of open it up to you. If you have any other thoughts that you wanna share for young entrepreneurs looking for success, those founders who are just starting out, what would you say are these are the keys to success that really should be followed.
I think that just be confident in yourself. I really do believe anyone can become a millionaire in today's day and age. And I think anyone can do it in a matter of years, but you certainly can't do it if you give up. So believe in yourself, try to solve a real problem for customers, and focus on growth and market share over profits.
It's beautiful. And one other thought that comes up, Emil. I know we're kind of jumping around on this, but I want to make sure that I have the chance to ask you. I know the Wall Street Journal piece has been everywhere as far as the work life balance conversation, and a lot of people say, well, it's easy when you're a nepo baby or you come from this or that. So I just kind of want to ask you, a little bit more about your background, your upbringing growing up, and what's your take is on that.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a small town in Ohio. Neither of my parents were entrepreneurs or millionaires by any extent. My mom was a school teacher. My dad worked in the insurance industry. Ultimately, I think that this is sort of a very good reflection of why people don't become rich. Because if they see someone make money at a young age or in a quick time, instead of thinking about how can I do that or how can I emulate that, they want to jump to what feels comfortable, which is, oh, he must have had family connections or some other thing that helps him that makes it impossible for me. And so I'm not mad at those people. In fact, it doesn't bother me, but I feel a little bit bad for them because I think that if instead of thinking that every single person that has been able to accomplish things at a young age had some sort of secret advantage, you could just realize that actually it's a lot simpler. You can become very wealthy and build a large business just by starting. So I guess to close out the thought, definitely not a Nepo baby. I am proud of the network I've been able to build, and I think that the network of mentors and celebrities and billionaires was very helpful in building the business. But I think that's because I went out, I provided value, I was authentic, and I tried to spend every waking hour I could dedicated to my business and learning as much about business as possible, even without family connections in the space.
Well, I think that's a good answer. And one thing that I'll say, just I guess a reaction, if you will, based on your comment is I always feel like when you cheer on other people's success, success is more likely to find you. So instead of, well, this person did that, I can't do that because this, and this. It's like this person did this. How can I do that too? Instead
Totally.
of trying to look for an excuse, try to look for the solution. Try to look for how can I emulate that. And I think a lot of times people lay the blueprints, and a lot of people are quick to disperse that or throw it to the side because they just associate that they're a nepo baby or whatever. And I think one of the biggest examples is Kylie Jenner. Like her family, her dad was a super rich lawyer. Her mom was, very well off, and she was obviously super, super rich before she started her cosmetic business, but it turned her into a billionaire. So if you just look on the multiplier of net worth on that, you're like, there's a lot to be learned. When you study success, I think it's more likely to find you. And when you cheer on other people's success, I feel like it's more likely to find you as well. And so one other question I have on that, you mentioned, not being a nepo baby, but how do you feel about generational wealth and what are your viewpoints on that?
I think that it's great that some people are afforded those opportunities. To your point, I don't think it's the only indicator of success. And if you're that confident that it is, go get a bank loan for $1 million. They'll let you do it if you put out a mortgage against your house and sort of personally guarantee it. And if you think the only thing separating you from Kylie Jenner is the lack of $1 million in your bank account to build a business, go out. In fact, I'll fund you. But the truth is, but I think that those people understand that there's more that goes into it than maybe having 1% of the capital that a company needs to go out and expand and become $1 billion business. I think the other thing is, it's easy to criticize, but if you don't like the way that Elon spends his money, go become the next Elon and donate it all and do something else. These people
Yeah.
have worked really hard for their money. And I think that, when we think about the world in the sense of it's possible for me to be like them, a lot more opportunities open up than we think about it in sort of the context of, oh, I'm never going to get there for X, Y, or Z.
I think that's a brilliant answer, and again, it's kind of that mindset of why not me? If somebody else does it, why can't you? And if somebody else is doing it and you'd like to do it better, then go do it. So
Totally.
I think that's great, and I like your stance there. I'm a big fan of generational wealth, as far as like if you didn't come from a rich family, make sure a rich one comes from you. And I think there's a
I
great
like
opportunity for everybody. Emil talked a lot about like how anybody can become a millionaire, and if anybody can become a millionaire, that means anybody's kids can be well off. When you go to give them their inheritance. So I
that.
think there's a lot of value and opportunity in America right now, and a lot of opportunity for wealth to be generated, not just for you, but also for future generations. And I do think that is available to really anybody who decides that it's available for them. So that's kind of my take. But Emil, I'm going to pass it to you and let you give a closing thought. If you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share with the audience, and then we'll wrap it up here.
Couldn't agree more. No, thanks for having me on. I think this was a great conversation. And if there's anything I can do to be helpful, I've just started posting on X, LinkedIn, socials. Honestly, just DM me there and I try to reply to every DM that I get.
Awesome. And if you're listening, I'll make sure if you click in the description below, we'll have all of Emil's handles, so you can find him there. And if you want to take him up on his $1 million loan, then you can find him in his DMs as well. So with
As
that
long as it's
said,
a billionaire
thank
like kind of thing.
and uh, and we'll see you next time.